Paul was a monumental figure in the early church. He wrote 13 of the 27 New Testament books in the Bible, 14 if you count the book of Hebrews. And of course, I believe that Paul wrote the book of Hebrews. Look at Hebrews chapter 13, verse number 23, and I'll show you why I believe that. Paul wrote this in closing. I want you to know that our brother Timothy has been released from jail. If he comes here soon, I will bring him with me to see you. Now, only Paul had this type of relationship with Timothy. In fact, he was like a spiritual son, and there'll be some scholars that will say, well, he would have said son if this was Paul, but I don't believe that because other places he refers to Timothy as our beloved brother. But as you read through the book of Hebrews and you see the deep doctrinal teachings within it, only someone like Paul could have written it, I believe. And when you couple it with this verse and his intimate relationship with Timothy, well, I believe that Paul wrote the book of Hebrews. Only he would have expected Timothy to come see him after being released from jail. He just expected him to do that. Now, apart from Jesus, no other person has been as influential in forming the doctrines of Christianity. In fact, Paul has been referred to as the second founder of Christianity. Jesus, of course, being the founder of the Christian faith. But most of the doctrines that define our faith come from Paul's writings. He was a master at weaving Old Testament theology and messianic prophecies into fundamental Christian doctrines that fully explain who Jesus is and what he's done for us. As a result of his writings, we understand how Jesus fulfilled God's master's plan for the human race. Now, because Paul was such an important figure in the early church, Luke devoted the majority of one of his books to the life and missionary journeys of Paul. And the book I'm referring to, of course, is the book of Acts. Acts is a history of the early church. If you want to get technical, it's a history of the Acts of the apostles. That's why it's named Acts, if you were wondering. And since Paul was a major player in the early church, and most of its history is about Paul and his life, then we're going to be able to see that Acts is going to focus on Paul. So, as we study Paul, we're going to spend the majority of our time in the book of Acts. But to really know the man and who he was, we're going to have to look at what he wrote in his epistles. Now, if you're not really a church person, you've only been coming for a short while, epistles is just a religious way of saying letters. You know, you don't talk about the love epistles you sent to your wife, do you? But actually, epistles simply means letters. These epistles were letters that Paul wrote to the church, and in them, he forms many of the doctrines of the church. Now, in our study, what we're going to do is we're going to try and harmonize Paul's writings with Luke's record of his life and missionary journeys. Our goal is to examine Paul's life in chronological order. So I'm going to be collating various scriptural references relating to each period of Paul's life. In other words, I'm going to take all of the pertinent scriptures from the book of Acts and Paul's epistles, and I'm going to place them in their proper sequence so you can see what transpired in Paul's life in chronological order. I'll also note what Paul was doing and where he was when he wrote each epistle. I'll take the time to briefly outline and point out the theme of each epistle in its historical setting. Now, by doing all of this, I'm going to be able to give you Paul's itinerary in the events that led up to his final years and eventually his martyrdom. Now, my objective in doing all of this is to help you gain a better understanding of the Apostle Paul, his life, and also, and most importantly, his teachings, so you can see what it means to be a true disciple of Jesus Christ.